All right, before I pick up where we're going, does anybody have any questions you want to ask about anything I've talked about so far this morning? Yes, sir.
Can you give an example of a church similar to Bob in this cycle that maybe you work with and know of that you mentioned some things, but where we are and where they are today based on?
Okay. Well, it's one just a little bit bigger, but last 5 or 6 years I've been working with the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada, which is that's the Assembly of God in Canada. And what's interesting is most of them are in the process of dying because it affects everybody. In fact, when I'm with them, I joke about the fact that for people who supposedly have an extra way to get to the Holy Spirit, it's not, how's it working for you, at that point. This was a church in not Alberta, Edmonton. About 1,000. And pastor had been there 30 years, and they had been plateaued for at least the last 10. They were having a little bit of growth, but when I said to them, where is the growth coming from? The pastor was very honest. He said, it's as the other assemblies around Edmonton die, they're coming here. So we're growing at the expense of them, but there really wasn't a lot of growth at that juncture. I said to him, how many people are you seeing come to Jesus for you? Maybe 25, maybe. I don't even think they had 50 as I remember. But for all the energy and people they had, this wasn't growing. And everybody was they had a board of like 14 or something like this. The person who was there, they were doing very contemporary worship, but it had become very formulaic, and the person it was just saying every service was the same, and people didn't want it to change, and all of that kind of stuff. So I said to the pastor, "Are you going to get serious about the Great Commission?" And God did a work in his heart, and he said to the church, "We're going to do this." Now he only had about a year or two left on his, because we talked about how he was going to gracefully exit and retire and succession, that kind of thing. And they went through the things we talked about. And beginning in last February, they started the process, the plan that I had given. And I was with him in June. And I said, "How's it going?" He said, "Oh, Paul," he said, "it has changed our church." He said, "When somebody comes to Christ during the week, our tradition has always been we put a helium-filled balloon with a string hanging out of it, and it's on the platform. It just floats around the platform all Sunday, just as a reminder to people." Now, some churches have done that with candles and other things. He said, since the last 2 months, whatever it was, he said, we have not had a Sunday that there wasn't a red balloon on the platform. And he said there were some Sundays, there were so many red balloons, the worship team had a hard time finding a place to stand. I said, "How many people come to Christ?" This was in June. He said, "Over 120. Just since February." Okay. And the church is now growing. Now, people are still transferring in, but the church is now growing with evangelism. They had another service that was really a millennial service. And it was all millennial Christians who are just as stubborn as millennials or seniors. Okay, I mean, stubbornness has nothing to do with age. And the service had to be this and it had to be that. And I don't know, it was a large number, like 30 or 40 of the 120 had come to Christ in the millennial service. And they were now reaching out to other unchurched millennials and their age. So that's the kind of thing we have seen in churches like that. So when I look at your church with all the resources you have in terms of your most important resource is people, and you still have at least on average 450 people here on the week, the money, the location, the facilities, I mean, I think you're sitting on a spiritual gold mine. Okay, and it's just a matter of getting the church back to the main thing at that point, from my perspective. Okay, does that answer? Okay.
Take us there. Oh, sure, Bob.
I hope I can be used by God to take you there. All right. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Yeah.
I went to school in Virginia.
Uh-huh.
Jerry Falwell. You wouldn't go to the grocery store without somebody meeting you, coming in or out of the grocery store asking you if you're sick.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what we're going to be doing? I'm just curious.
Well, hopefully you're going to be doing that in a culturally relevant way for 2019. Because here's the thing. The gospel never changes, but the church must change constantly, which I think is demonstrated in even how we present the gospel. So when in the 50s, 1950s, 60s, evangelism explosion comes along, that whole presentation of the gospel is based on a Christendom culture. Now, as you know, Florida is God's waiting room. So all the people from, the Northeast, all the people from the Northeast retire to the East Coast. All the people from the Midwest retire to the West Coast. And many of them had come out of the what's now the Rust Belt. So many of them were Roman Catholics who had been to church 3 times. For the most part, when you're hatched, matched, and dispatched. Okay, I mean, that's when they go to church. So, but because of a Christendom culture, they believed in a God. They believed in a heaven and a hell. They believed that this God was going to judge them. They had been raised in a whole tradition of guilt. And so when you would knock on a door, which you could do, in this day and age, most churches, I don't think it is knocking on doors. But when you knock on a door and say, if you were to die tonight and stand before God, there was at least cultural guilt that they could trade on, which has gone away, which is, I think they were using legitimately, but I grew up where most preachers, that was the only way preachers were taught to motivate, was to create guilt, and so I don't believe you do that. But they were working on that cultural guilt, and people would come to Christ. So that there's a book I'm impressed with, Don and I talked a little bit about it, a guy by the name of Rick Richardson. And he said, if you think of the main models in the 1900s, you got evangelism explosion, you've got probably the person who was responsible for more people coming to Christ than anybody else is Bill Bright, so you've got the 4 laws, you've got Billy Graham. That was all based, from my perspective, on working in a Christendom culture, and it was really almost a salesperson model. I'm to engage you in a conversation. I have something I need you to buy. Only I'm giving it away at this point. And then I've got to get them across the line, etc. I believe in this day and age, it's another whole model. And the way I look at it in Scripture is, when you look at the Apostle Paul, on his missionary journeys, he always started with Jewish proselytes, the Jews who were living in other cities. Okay. He always started with them, and man, everybody came to Christ. So many people came to Christ, they would kick him out because the leaders were losing control. Because as a Pharisee of the Pharisees, he knew how to use the Old Testament to tie them into theological knots and show them that Jesus was Messiah. He gets to Mars Hill, and all of a sudden, here's the philosophers. They don't even know there's an Old Testament. They don't even know there's a Moses. They'd never heard of Jesus. And it's interesting, when he shares the gospel, he doesn't even use Scripture. He uses theology. And when he gets to the resurrection, it says most of them listened no more. And I think as you look at what Paul's writing about evangelism in Philippians and in Colossians, particularly Colossians chapter 4, which he says, be devoted to prayer. And what's interesting, in that paragraph, 4:2, he says, be devoted to prayer. Now, we look at that and we say, all right, now we're going to preach on Francis of Assisi and A.W. Tozer. All of his prayer requests are evangelistic. And interesting, the second request, he says, help me, this is a paraphrase, but help me get the gospel right or explain the gospel. And I remember as I was preparing for a sermon, I thought, if Paul didn't have the gospel right, he wrote Romans. He wrote Galatians. I think what he's saying is, I need help to figure out how to present the gospel to people who don't have Jewish backgrounds. So, yes, if this church, and I'm going to talk about if this church is not one where people are making gospel presentations and sharing the gospel, then this isn't going to work. But it's got to be done. So I'm jumping ahead now, but I want to respond to your question. Oh, go ahead.
I have a second class. Being part of a church, like I went to the Assembly of God church, and I grew from a little like 50-person church to 1,000 person
Mm-hmm.
in a 7-year period of time. And so we were part of that core of that church. We were with the initial part. It was all about saving the lost.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm right there with
Yeah.
you and what you're, because I mean we went to addiction places where people
Yeah.
had addictions and they were trying to get out of their addiction.
Yeah.
And that is the best place to like literally bring people to God because they were
Right.
broken and
Okay.
and our pastors had actually been through that. So
Right.
and-
Okay.
But anyway, like it took a lot to get there,
Sure.
obviously.
Right.
Is there like a step-by-step program?
Well, first of all, that step-by-step program in some ways has already started. You've had a reinvigoration of Alpha. You've had Don and Phil talking about, Don's book and what's there. That's a great start, but that's got to be built upon. And there's got to be more training, but there also has to be modeling by the leaders. And so we're going to talk about that as well. By the way, the fact that the current Alpha group, from everything I've heard, have been told is basically Bonham people. That's wonderful, as long as the next time it's offered, those Bonham people are there with a guest who doesn't know Jesus. This is not a course you take. I go into all these eco churches and say, well, we did Alpha. I said, well, how many people come to Jesus? They said, nobody. I said, well, you take it again. You missed it. You blow it. Okay? That's the whole point of Alpha. And by the way, here's the thing about Alpha. Other places can do this. When Jesus talked about being fishers of men and women, that's a metaphor. Fishing's a metaphor. Okay? It's a picture. So when you think of fishing, what do you think of? Rod and reel. When the disciples heard the word fishing, what did they think of? Nets. You do net fishing together, and you catch more fish with net fishing. The only way you catch more is with dynamite. Okay, and you don't kind of fish that way. And what we're saying to churches is, we wanted to teach our churches how to do net fishing, and we found that if they would do net fishing, they were more open to doing rod and reel fishing. And I think one of the problems that evangelism has, when we do worship, we do it together. When we do teaching, I can study the Bible alone, but when we think of instruction, we do it together. When we do fellowship, it's kind of hard to do that apart from people. You do that together, and then we say, now you go share the gospel. Last year, I did 6 of these weekends in 7 weeks with eco churches. And 3 churches in a row on Saturday. In each church, an elder spoke up in the afternoon, because then people are more comfortable to ask questions, but spoke up, said the same exact words in essence. Paul, I know we're supposed to share the gospel. I don't do it because I'm afraid. And I don't do it because I don't know how. Now, I think that's incumbent upon us who are in leadership to say, we need to show you how to do it. We need to give you opportunities how to do it. But often the way you help people get involved in it is to give them net fishing experiences. And Alpha does that, because when you go and take someone to Alpha, you get to watch Don or whoever's leading it be the fisherman. Okay? But you're part of that. You're part of that throwing the net. And the more you can do in terms of net fishing, in fact, I'm going to show you this in just a minute, the more then people are open to doing rod and reel fishing. Okay? Does that help make sense? Okay. All right. I'm going to pick up 2 questions. Door number 3. Okay? Door number 1, we run the church for us. That's not working, folks. Not working in the country anywhere. Door number 2, we run the church not for us, but for the people who aren't yet Christians. That's secret churches, and those who are doing it well, they continue to grow. Okay. Door number 3, we're going to do both. We're going to run the church for us, but we're also at times going to run the church for the people who aren't here yet. if you say we want door number 3, what's the first question you have to ask? Anybody want to guess? Yeah, who gets priority? If we get priority, we go back to door number 1. If the unbeliever gets priority, we stay at door number 3. Okay? But here's the second question. And all of you are, one way or another, asking it is, how do you do it? Okay? So, turn with me to page 9. On page 9 is a mission ministry audit. If you'll notice the vertical line on the left, it is the focus of the ministry. It's either internal, meaning it's for us, or it is external, meaning it's for those who aren't here yet. If you'll notice the horizontal line on the bottom, it's the purpose of the ministry. It's either to entertain or edify. Christian concerts are entertainment. Church potlucks are entertainment. It's cheap entertainment, but it's entertainment. Or edify. Or it's to equip or evangelize. So if you accept the mission, say we want to be a church that's going to grow by doing the Great Commission, we're going to say that you have to take every ministry of the church. Now, in your church, that could take a whole year. And say to that church, first of all, which of these 4 boxes are you in? So I'm going to ask you, as you look at most ministries here, which box would they fit into? Bottom left. That's true of all churches. Now, realize what that means. It means that even if we say in our mission statement we're going to do the Great Commission, in most churches, all the ministries of the church are not aligned to do it. That's why we don't do the Great Commission, because we don't spend most of our time focusing on it. Okay? So, when you go to this ministry and you say, you're in this box, I say, yeah, we are. We're here for Christians, and we want to edify people, want to build them up. Say, okay, that's fine. But here's the question. How in the next 12 months are you going to do at least 3 things that will put you in the upper right-hand box? You with me? Now, here's the tough part. If they say, and I've actually been in eco churches that have adopted what I've talked about, and they have had ministries say, no, we're not going to do that. Then I've said to the session, you need to tell that ministry you are no longer considered a viable ministry of our church, and we will ignore you. Why? You say, well, that's hard. Yeah. But if you're not going to do the mission, why be a part of our church? I mean, Presbyterians, Baptists, Lutherans, all alike. Everybody's always eating. And you have all these meals, do all this stuff, and all we do is entertain ourselves. Okay. Why? Because we like each other. We like the food. And we're willing to subsidize all of our Christian giving for our bellies. Or subsidize our bellies with our Christian giving. Okay. Nothing wrong with eating, but have you ever decided to eat with a purpose? And I don't mean the purpose is to fill your belly. Okay? So, churches that do this begin now to say, how are we going to do net fishing together? So I got to give you some illustrations. About 4 years ago, I was working with a church, going back to your question, Phil, just a little bit smaller than yours. Church about 300, 350, somewhere in there. Plateaued. And they said, we want to do the Great Commission. I said, all right, you got to do the audit. So they began to work through the church. They got to the women's ministry. The women would do 10 things a year, one every month, and take 2 months off in the summer. And it was normally around food. They'd have a tea, there'd be a dinner, whatever. When they said how many women are showing up, that was 30 to 50 women, which sounds like it's a good ministry until they asked the question, who are the women who are showing up? Well, you know who they are. They're women from that church or from other churches who want to come to this woman's event. So the women's ministry was not helping make new disciples for Jesus Christ. So they said to the women, what are you going to do? And it's interesting, this church, the women were ahead of the game. They said, we've already thought about that. We know what we're going to do. 3 times a year, once in the fall, once in the winter, and once in the spring, our event will be a banquet. I mean, this is not going to be your typical church potluck with the lime jello with a pear on the bottom and the green bean casserole and the deviled eggs that pastors never get to eat because we have to stand at the back of the line. Not that I'm angry about that, but okay. This is going to be tablecloths, silverware, etc. And we're going to sell tickets. Now, the purpose of the tickets is not to cover the cost of the banquet because the tickets will be quite inexpensive. The purpose of the tickets is you can't get into the banquet without a ticket. However, we will tell the women who are selling the tickets, we'll say to the whole congregation, if you want to come to our event, or if you're a lady in another church and you want to come to our event, you cannot buy 1 ticket. You must buy 2 tickets and give us the name of the unchurched woman you've invited to come with you as your guest. Because when the banquet's over, we're going to ask a lady in our church or a lady outside speaker to talk about her faith relationship with Jesus, and maybe even invite the women there to follow Jesus just as she has decided to follow Jesus. So what they were saying is, so 7 times a year, the ministry's for us. But 3 times a year, we want to be part of the mission of the church. 6 or 7 years ago, I'm working with a Presbyterian church that used to be 500 or 600. At that time, they were bigger than you are now. And when I'm there, there's about 60 people. Average age in the 70s. They couldn't afford their facilities. They said, do you think we can grow again? I said, all older people, for the most part. I said, yeah. They said, all right, you got to make the Great Commission priority. And I said, you got to do the audit. So you got to do every ministry in the church. When I'm talking about every small group, every Sunday school class, the choir, worship team, pastoral staff, session, deacons. What are you going to do the Great Commission? Everybody has to have responsibility. So they still had 2 adult Sunday school classes left. So they audited the first class. They realized it had been meeting for 65 years. And when it started, it had been called the Young Marriage Class. And it had 80 people in it. When they did the audit, there were 10 people ages 75 to 85. Attrition had occurred. This class hadn't made a new disciple for Jesus in years. And they said, what are you going to do? And again, these older people said, we want to be part of the mission. So here's what we're going to do. Most of us are physically incapable of getting to church on our own. People pick us up on Sunday, bring us to church, take us home. So we can't be like the women's ministry. But here's what we can do. Every Sunday in our class, as every ministry in the church is working with different people who don't know Jesus, if you will give us a list, 5, 10, 15 names of people who don't know Jesus, prime time in our class, we will stop and pray for each one by name and ask that the Spirit of God will convict of sin, righteousness, and judgment and bring that person to Jesus. Okay? Now, I never thought about this, but most of our prayers in church are to keep people out of heaven. We keep asking God to heal them. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's okay. But seldom in churches do we have intensive prayer for people who don't. Okay? I was sharing this at a conference, not an eco conference, another conference, and during the break, youth pastor came up to me. He said, oh, Paul, he said, I do this all the time. He said, now he was in a big church. He said, we have about 100 senior high in the youth group. He said, every Sunday, I go to 3 of my students, because we have about 6 high schools represented. I go to 3 of them, one from this school and one from this school, one school. And I said, I want to come to school, your school on Tuesday, and I want to buy lunch for you and 10 of your friends. On Wednesday, I said, I want to buy lunch for you and 10 of your friends and lunch for you and 10 of your friends. The only condition is the 10 friends you invite have to be kids that don't go to school or go to church. He said, and every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, I'm in the schools having spiritual conversations with a bunch of unbelieving kids, and I'm also modeling for my students. I would call it net fishing. Okay? So every ministry does. Mega church, plateaued. And they said, we're going to get serious about the Great Commission. They were plateaued at about 2,500. Mega church technically is 2,000 people in a church on Sunday or larger. And so when you're a mega church, you don't have a church softball team. You have a softball league, basketball league, etc. You actually even have a sports pastor, okay, because you have a sports ministry. Well, they realized that all their sports stuff, all it was doing was simply replicating what the city did, what the county did, only they just called it ministry. And they said, we either got to stop it because it's a waste of time, money, and energy. People can go, if they want to play softball or basketball, they can go play in the leagues. But this is not helping us do our mission, or we change it. So they have changed it. So this is really a stretch of an illustration because my wife hates sports, but suppose my wife and I are younger and we're leading a small group. And we come to the sports pastor and we say, our small group would like to be in your co-ed volleyball league. They say, well, we need to ask you some questions. Okay, what's the first question? How many people in your team don't go to church? Well, nobody. It's our small group. Well, then you can't be in the league. Why? Because half the team has to be unchurched. Well, we don't know any unchurched people. We'll take a year and meet some and come back next year. Okay? But you got to have, so we come back next year and we got two teams because we've doubled in size because we got all the, who are the captains? Well, I'll captain one team, my wife will captain the other team. Have you taken our course on friendship evangelism? No. Well, then you can't be in the league. Why didn't you tell us that last year? Could have done this, okay? Anything else? Yeah, the third question. Once you can be in the league, before the season starts, your job is to gather all the Christians together, over dinner, barbecue, whatever. And you're to tell them that their job is not to win the league championship. It's to become friends with all the unchurched people. Okay. About 4 years later, I was with that pastor, and I said, how's this thing going with your sports thing? He said, oh, Paul. He said, in our church, this is probably the number one place where most people come to Jesus. In fact, he said, a couple of months back, one of the guys in church went up to the sports pastor and he said, next week we're playing for the league championship in the slow pitch softball league. And the pastor said, well, that's cool. He said, we have a problem. I said, what's your problem? He said, we keep losing our percentage. They keep coming to Jesus. And our best hitter, if you ever played so, but he's that guy who hits a home run almost every time. He said, he's that close to believing. Can we wait a week before we say anything else to him? Then now go ahead and play. Most of the reason why the churches don't do the mission is because most of the ministries are not aligned around the mission. Okay. I was here the day, and I actually had a focus group of the SEALs, and I was sitting there, they're Veterans Day, and I thought, why not have a bunch of people who don't go to church, who are veterans? You got this person who's, invite them to dinner. Let them go here. And in the process, if it's somebody from the church, let them talk about their faith. I could be a charter member of the SEALs. I'm 75, and if you've got unbelievers coming, it's amazing how, are they even going to be upset if you talk about death? Because they all know they're facing it. It's getting closer. I think more about death now. I never thought about death when I was a teenager. Okay, I had a whole life in front of me. Now it's a whole different matter. So the question is, how does every ministry? And if it doesn't, then you have to say that's no longer a ministry of the church. That's a tough decision. But that's how you begin to implement this. Second thing I want to talk about. And in this one, I'm not going to say that you have to do this, but I am going to say you have to follow the principles. Every church I am with, I don't care if they're churches of 50 or churches of 2,000, do big events to get people on their campus, hoping that if they get on their campus for the event, they will come to church. And every church I say, how's that working for you? And they say, it isn't. And so I try to help churches distinguish between what I call an advertising event and a bridge event. So turn with me to page 7. This is entitled Build a Bridge and Get Over It. Okay. By the way, this is one of our pastors. If you're not aware, Clovis, California is a suburb of Fresno. In fact, when you drive out of Fresno into Clovis, you don't know it. Fresno is about 500,000. Clovis is about 300,000. But if people move there and they have children, they usually want to live in Clovis because they have a better reputation for the school system. Okay. Pastor went to this church. They were down to 40. The average age was 72. 15 years later, when he left, the church was running 1,000, and they had seen over 800 people come to Jesus during those 15 years. Okay. But they realized their big events weren't working. So I'm going to read part of this. Bridge events are special events used to connect unchurched people to the church and move them into a relationship with Jesus Christ. As we examined our bridge events at First Baptist Church of Clovis, we realized that we were attracting tourists. People stopped by to take a look at it and enjoy our work, but our bridges led them nowhere. Few new people returned to church for worship, and people were not moving to other environments where they could connect with Jesus Christ. We had designed events that were attractional but not missional. Attracting people was great, but we also wanted to provide an effective way to fulfill our mission. Now, here's their mission statement of leading an ever-increasing number of people into a life-changing relationship with Jesus Christ. That's why we exist. That's the why. So, we consider 3 questions to help us design bridge events. And what I'm saying is, if you decide to accept this, that anytime you do a large event, that the church will say, this year we're only going to do 6 advertising events. We're not. If we're going to do a big event, we just say, but any other events have to answer these questions. So, question 1. What is the next step we want people to take? This helps to bring clarity where we want to move people in our discipleship process. We used to gauge the success of our events by the attendance. Although this is one indicator of success, it should not have been our only measurement. We should have been measuring the number of people who took the next defined step in our process. So, I want to illustrate it. I want all the men in the room who are married to think about your first date. Now, John, that's going to be ancient history, so it may take a while, but think about your first date with your wife. Okay. Assuming it was a good date, because not all first dates are good dates, but assuming it was a good date, when were you planning the second date? Huh? During the date. Yeah. I mean, I'm old enough, when I get home, do I call her? Nobody calls anybody, but do I call her? All right. You're planning it second date, okay? Now, all the women in the room, I want you to think about the first date. Suppose you just had a great date with this guy you really like, and he doesn't contact you for 3 months. What happens? Probably married somebody else.
He becomes my husband.
Well, it could be. All right. That's the way we are with the community. We'll see you at Christmas. We'll see you at Easter. We'll see you at the 4th of July. We'll see you. We never have a second date. So that's the first question. So, I've heard, there's some talk, I guess, about wanting to do some concerts, do outreach. Realize if there isn't a second date, people show up if they like music, but doesn't mean they're going to come back to church. Okay. Question 2. Can this event be paired with other existing programming? This helps to eliminate additional steps to have people take after the event to reconnect with the church, and it helps to merge resources and volunteers for greater effectiveness. What day of the week do you have most people here? Sunday. So, a lot of times, these events ought to take place on Sunday. Now, I want to talk about this. Remember our mission. And by the way, I'm going to give you a mission statement. And here it is. Bonham Presbyterian Church exists to honor God by making more disciples for Jesus Christ. That's your mission. Okay. So how do you evaluate everything in line to that mission? Now, we're going to be at door number 3. So we do both. We want to service the Christians, but we also want to service the people who aren't Christians, and we're going to give them priority. How do we do that in terms of Sunday? I have learned that the best thing about Christmas is not getting the right gift. It's giving the right gift. Every 10 years I get it right with my wife. The way I know that is the next time I see it, she's actually wearing it. It's not on eBay. Okay, that's how I know. Okay. And man, I can tell. She thinks she covers it. But that's the one intuitive thing I can do. I blow it this. I don't know why the vacuum cleaning didn't please her. No, I'm kidding. Okay. All right. I'm saying that your church 3, 4, maybe 5 Sundays a year, are you willing to give that day as a gift to people who will come if you do the right things when many of them are not believers, and have that day for them? 45 days, Sundays a year, it's for us. Now, I think you still have to be very guest friendly. We'll talk about that. But we're going to give that. So, for example, I would move your VBS to near the end of the summer when kids are getting ready to go back to school and they finally get away, because I've heard around here it's like the desert when people leave, okay? That's not time to have VBS. But during VBS, not only should the kids be getting ready for that closing presentation, I'd make it highly competitive so every kid wins something. And do a combined worship service in the John's Hall down there. That's your VBS closing. And then after they do the singing, whatever, kids walk across the platform and get their award from a pastor. Now, when that takes 20, 25, 30 minutes, it messes up your liturgy. But you see, that's Sundays, not for us. That Sunday is for people who, if you work at getting, our goal in our churches that we set for our churches was, I don't care how many children you have from the church, you ought to have the equal number of children who come from unchurched homes. Now, just to show you how consumer-oriented we are, VBS in most communities has become Christian babysitting. Because all the Christian families look at all the where the VBS is and send their kids. In fact, I said to our pastors, will you call up at least the other evangelical pastors and tell them, please don't send your kids. Not because we're trying to be snooty. We only have so many resources. And we're working hard to get kids from unchurched homes. This is part of our mission. I would say I would do the same thing with the preschool graduation. I mean, folks, your preschool is a gold mine of people who have a relationship with the church, who don't know Jesus. And somebody's, this is not a surprise to Sharon. I've talked about it, but some other people said, well, what about the children that their parents go to other churches? Number one, if they want them here, they'll get them here. And those same parents, I will guarantee you, if their son or daughter is in Little League and they have a Sunday game, they'll miss church. So don't give me this, But when you've got kids, I've heard coming from India and other parts of the world, to have them here and to realize that Sunday is not for us. And you can do that, and that's when you want to have a reception. But then you also need to think about, what do we do on that day for the second date? What's the second date that needs to happen? Okay, so number 3, how will we follow up on guests who attend our events? This forces us to examine our assimilation or connection system, whatever term you want to use. We had a good system of follow-up for guests who attend worship. We had a terrible system of follow-up on guests who attend our special events. Now, folks, you're not even doing a good job on Sunday. Now, let me get back to the friendly church. And I'm going to jump, I'll come back to this, but I'm going to jump briefly to the R. Okay? Relationships. This is not a domino. This is a Lego. Okay? It's horrible when you have to explain your art, but this is a Lego. You play with Legos by connecting them. And the reason I've drawn a Lego with 8 connectors is most people in any social setting want to have 8 sustained relationships. People that when they come and go, whether it's work, whether it's a club, whether it's a church, over a 3-month period, you will know more people, you say hello to more people, but there's about 8 people you want to connect with. Now, if you're an introvert, you only have 2 connectors on your Lego. If you're an extrovert, you got 16. But the average is about 8. Okay? Now, when you've been in a church, as long as most of you have been in a church, your Lego is full. You can't have any more connecting relationships, even if you want to. I was in a small church, and I was talking about this, and a young woman raised her hand. She was doing children's ministry. She said, Paul, she said, I'm responsible for children's ministry, which you know, I mean, you got to recruit and all that kind of stuff. She said, I'm leading a small group. She said, we're in a small town. My husband and I have some other friends. We go camping with at times. She said, in the last 2 or 3 months, 2 or 3 women who are new to the church called me, and I knew they wanted to be my friend, and I knew I had no space in my week for that. And the problem was, I didn't know who to pass them off to. Now, here's the deal. People expect your church to be friendly, but they're not looking for a friendly church. They're looking for friends. And there is a major difference between being friendly and making friends. And most of you in here, because I've met good people, love Jesus, you can't be friends with them, not because you're bad people, it's simply because you have a full ego. So the purpose of a connection system means that from the time the person first drives up in your parking lot, comes in, first impressions, most people have made up their mind to come back in the first 5 to 10 minutes. Which, by the way, when they walk in your empty traditional services because it's less than 50% full, which is like going to a Cardinals game and there's only 11,000 people there, you say that place was empty. No, it's not. It's got 11,000 people, but it's less than 50% full. Okay? When they walk in, it says immediately, loser, 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 loser. Now you say, well, they ought to look past it, but if they don't know Jesus, they're not looking for that. But the other thing they're looking for is a friend, and what they're saying is, how are you going to help me make a friend? Now, here's what we've learned. If you can help people make friends within the first month or 2 that they come to church, they stay. Okay? Now, all I'm saying at this point, I know the deacons have a group that's working on this, and that's wonderful. But it is moving way too slowly. Also, and I don't mean this, I would say this in any church, because this is not in any way a negative thing about the deacons, is they don't know what they're supposed to be looking for. You need to have people who that first Sunday are going to be connected. What's going to happen with them during the week? What communication they're going to get? What happens differently the second time they come back? What happens differently the third time they come back? How do you eventually get them into, whether it's a dinner at Phil's home, and I know he's going to have a dinner for guests, but we talk to church about, where you have pizza with the pastor or pasta with the pastor, in California gluten-free salad with the pastor, but where the whole point of the meeting. So when you have a gathering of your guests, Phil and Carrie need to be there. And here's, guests here, guests here, guests here, guests here, guests here. All of you, your job is to serve, not to sit there. Because if you sit there and are nice to them, which you will be, they're going to think you'll be my friend. And you can't be their friend. So here's the agenda for that event. First of all, Phil and Carrie want to get to know things about them. Number 2, they want to get to know things about Phil and Carrie. Number 3, hopefully by that time Phil's got his 10-minute elevator stump speech about the vision, because we're giving you a vision too. It's a heart for West County. It's why you exist. Heart for West County. Mission is to make disciples, and the vision is always about the community. How will the community be changed because you've done your mission? Okay? I'll come back to that in a minute. But anyway, so then the rest of the time, Phil and Carrie's responsibility is to help them make friends with each other. Why? Because in your setting, they are all empty Legos. And they still have room to connect. Make sense? So, ushers need to be trained on what to do. Deacons need to be trained to know, or ushers, networkers, greeters. Everybody needs training to know what to do. And there's a team. Now, how do you do that? Well, I'll guarantee you there's a bunch of the larger churches here in the St. Louis area that have learned how to do it. And what you need to do is get your team, go over there, say, will you teach us, and can we come on Sunday and watch you? I'm putting together a whole thing for eco-pastors at a church in Cobleskill, New York, a little town of 3,000 or 4,000. I mean, it's so small. The head of the mafia, I think, is Czechoslovakian. And church was 180, plateaued, 180. By the way, their mission was to make disciples. Their vision was to see 1% of their county come to Jesus in 5 years, which was 320 people. They got 252 new disciples in 5 years. I saw you achieved it. Okay, you had a goal, because most churches like Charlie Brown shoots the iron on the fence and paints a target around it. You have a goal. But they're keeping between 50 to 80% of all first-time guests. And they're your size. Okay? Because they work at it, and this is something that has to become a major staff responsibility. From my perspective, that needs to be front burner on one of the staff members' plates, not your pastor, but one of the staff members. That team has to be in place. And the job is because if you can't help people connect, there's no sense doing big events. And by the way, when you do a big event, that team has to realize this week, suppose you did the nursery school or preschool graduation, we might have 100 connecting. We've got to follow up this week. And how do we follow up with them next week? That's why the system, a lot of this is going to be done with good administrative assistant help. By the way, this is one of your main growth engines in the church, is helping people make friends quickly. Being friendly is nice, but that doesn't help you grow. Okay? So,